Hello everyone, Ron again, and in this video we're going to talk about bass and bass clarity. So I'm going to make this simple. At first I had a bunch of stuff I was going to say, but I think I'm just going to separate it because I have to explain one of these plugins, this one right here, Fruity Peak Controller. But I'm going to start off with practical tips in this one. So the first way to achieve bass clarity is to not add reverb to your bass because it causes mud. In the last video, I showed that a sound that has lower frequencies is going to produce mud because the bass makes it sound diffused. And well, I didn't get into how lower frequencies are actually longer. And so that's why they are less frequent in a second, right? Because kilohertz, for example, is a frequency repetition in thousands of times per second. So let's say when you have 440 hertz, that means that wave cycles 440 times a second. So if you have 440 hertz, there's 440 cycles of that sound wave per second, and that is what we label as A, right? The note A. So when you have something like bass, say if it's 100 hertz, it's 100 cycles per second. To take up the same second without, ending early, so to speak, the 100 cycles are going to be longer. So that's why bass is easier for bass to cause mud and reverb, because you're diffusing something that already naturally has a longer cycle. So the first tip is not to add reverb to your bass, because it will add mud to your mix just because of the nature of bass and how we perceive it. So the next one is to leave the bass elements in mono, and this goes back to talking about phase cancellation, right? So in the flangers video, I think it was, I was talking about how when you add the chorus effect to a sound and you make more than one copy of that sound, and then you modulate the time of the delay over those multiple copies, the sound starts to become thin because there is a lot of phase related manipulation going on. And so if you're thinking about something like a kick drum, right? Even thinking as simple as phase cancellation itself, just if you have phase cancellation happening and it is knocking out the volume of your kick drum, it's not going to be clear and it's not going to be punchy because it's being canceled out. So you're not even hearing the full impact of the bass. And the same thing goes with bass when you try to stereoize it. Like there's a way to cause our ear to perceive bass as being stereo, but as far as bass really truly being like spread apart in stereo, it would become really sort of phased out and thin if you were to do it. Just like adding stereo width to a bass with something like a chorus effect, it wouldn't sound good. So that's to be considered. The bass elements that are truly in the bass spectral frequencies, like down here, say, I think of it as being like 300 hertz and lower, those you should keep in mono. And the other reason is that they're going to cut through the mix more, because being in mono means the same part plays through both speakers, right? And it's better for the listener because if they're listening in mono, obviously you don't want phase cancellation. But if you're in the car, for example, the passenger and the driver both hear the bass the same way, rather than it being panned to one side and say it's panned to the right and the passenger hears it better and the driver is like, I hate this song, so they turn it off because they can't hear the bass. It's better to have the bass in mono for that reason, so that it's playing equally through both speakers, is in the center, because we can't perceive the direction of bass very well either. That's another thing that you can research in your spare time. So in the last video, I was talking about sidechain compression. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about something very similar, except it's not quite compression, even though it acts like compression. I guess if I had to label this as anything, I would label it as dynamic EQ. That's the closest thing that it comes to. being as far as terminology anyway. I don't know if this specific idea has a name, but let's look at Fruity Peak Controller, right? So Fruity Peak Controller controls the peaks. No, I'm just kidding. But if you look here, you got the peak section and the LFO section. We're not going to talk about the LFO section. It probably does exactly what you imagine, but the peak section, it sets some parameter. In this case, it's connected to node 1 of this EQ that's right here. The base is the starting value of the other parameter. So if I move this downward, for example, then that EQ node would just be lower. We want it to be at 50% because at 50%, the other parameter is starting at its default setting. Volume determines how much the parameter that the peak controller is affecting goes up or down. So here I have it set to go down to -81%. You can see in the top left hand corner. And so every time when there is a peak that passes through this, it's going to go down by that amount. The other parameter, that is, which is again EQ node 1. Tension is how fast it's going to react to the peak passing through. So when you turn it more to the right, it reacts faster. When you turn it to the left, it reacts more slowly, and decay causes it to last throughout the entire sound. So getting that out of the way, you may recall that sidechain compression was about making one sound duck in response to another, and this is literally that same idea. You could use Fruity Peak Controller to sidechain any parameter so that it's going to duck or increase rather than duck, because if you turn the volume knob to the other way, it's bipolar, so it will increase the parameter that's set instead. Same goes for bass. If I wanted to make it so that it starts higher than the default, I could do that. So now why would I do this? Which actually I'm going to get into what I did. So this is a low shelf, which means that it is going to lower all the frequencies that are below that, but it's not going to cut them out. And the low shelf is going to lower everything that's below that frequency node right there. So let's visit the idea of interference in the sense that sounds compete with each other when they are playing the same frequency, and the concept of masking. Now, one thing that makes your bass muddy is not just that you added reverb to it because you hadn't watched this video yet and nobody had told you not to. It's also the fact that you may have a bass and a kick and they're competing with each other. So as I had described in the sidechain compression video, when you have two things that are in the same space, one solution is to make one of them duck as the other is playing so that you hear that one and then you bring back up the volume or whatever parameter you caused it to duck by, but it's usually volume or gain. You bring that other parameter back up when it ends. It's exactly the same idea here, but rather than to duck the entire bass, because as you'll see, the bass has a really pronounced frequency range. Actually, I can show it to you beforehand. Solo my voice. Press play. You can see it right there. That's the bass. Not the kick, but the bass. Before I play the audio example, I just wanted to explain that though. So because the bass has a lot of higher frequencies that are higher than the actual range that the kick is playing in where I want to hear it, which is around here, just from 500 hertz down. That's what I wanted to hear mainly. But the bass has a bunch of harmonics that are above that. But I still want to hear those. I don't want those to duck because they're not interfering with the kick. So what I did was to connect this to Fruity Peak Controller. And you would do that by going to this, which is the frequency linked to controller. You have to have this already set up. And so then you attach it to the peak of attack kick, and after that you press accept. That's how you do this in FL Studio. You don't actually have to sidechain the channel because the Fruity Peak controller sends the information by itself, and it can send the information to all the different channels where there is a parameter that's being affected. In other words, I could connect multiple things to this single instance of peak controller. Like say if I did want to actually sidechain something the regular way, I could use peak controller, and if I wanted to sidechain multiple tracks, I could put gain knobs on them and make all of them duck the same amount. Without having to put a compressor on each one and switch it to sidechain mode, I could just use gain. And that's the genius behind Fruity Peak Controller. In reality, that's why I like it so much. The other positive benefit to using Fruity Peak Controller is that when you sidechain or you link a track to another mixer track in FL Studio, if you solo the first track that is sending to the other one, it will continue to solo the other ones with it. And sometimes you just want to hear that track by itself. Like you might want to hear a track without reverb, for example. But if you've done a reverb bus, every time you solo it, the reverb will stay soloed with it. You know, you might want to hear it in isolation for whatever reason, because they do come up. Especially when you do your own sound design. But with Fruity Peak Controller, that's not going to be an issue. All the other ones will mute as well. So that's another benefit for why you might consider it rather than sidechain compression. Because you could sidechain a gain plugin, and not literally sidechain, of course. You put a gain plugin on a different mixer track, connect it to Fruity Peak Controller, and make it duck without having to sidechain it. So with that being said, let's get into the audio example. So here is what I have prepared. Doesn't have a name yet. I just made it up like 2 days ago because I got a request for this video. And of course, what I'm going to talk about in the next video is also related to this same thing. But I'll get into the foreshadowing at the end of the video. So let's listen. So as you can see, every time the kick drum plays, the bass ducks. And it makes for more clarity in the bass itself because you can hear the bass and you can hear the kick drum and you can see the upper harmonics as the bass is playing. But they're not affected because it's ducking from here down. And so the rest of them remain perfectly intact. You know, so that is another technique you might want to use where you're just controlling certain frequencies and you cause those to duck every time something happens. Now that I think about it, that would make an interesting sound design idea. I had to test that out with multiple nodes. Making a comb filter. Sweet. So now, before I conclude this video and talk about what I'm going to talk about in the next video, let's just listen to the difference of what it sounds like without that, because I did the after without doing the before. And then I'll get into what's going to happen for tomorrow. So let's listen. So even though the EQ node was still moving because it's still attached to the Fruity Peak controller, when I turned off the EQ is bypassed and it's not having any effect. And I'm sure that when I turned it off, you could hear that it becomes a little bit harder to hear the kick drum because the bass is playing while it is playing. But to sidechain the bass, so to speak, quote unquote sidechain, in this way, where you have it, the EQ just ducking, it makes the bass, or rather the kick drum, become the more dominant of the two presences, because it's like the bass moves out of the way for the kick. So you feel the impact of the kick, which you wouldn't feel if you just had all of that bass sustaining the whole time because of the competing frequencies. Because you're used to the bass and the bass will win. The kick does not happen as much and it certainly doesn't sustain. So even though you hear the transient because it's two different timbres, which is a different topic, because I learned that from a friend about sound design and mixing, The two different timbres allow you to distinguish the two sounds because one of them is a transient and one of them is a sustain, but they still will compete. And you hear the transient pop out more when the sustain just moves out of the way. And obviously the sustain is going to duck because it's sustaining, right? So with that being said, I hope that you got value out of that. And before I end this video, let's talk about what I'm going to talk about in the next video. We're going to talk about how to achieve punchiness and probably thinking about bass as it's going to be played through a laptop and a cell phone, because I suppose those things contribute to clarity and, you know, a good listening experience everywhere. In any case, I have an example of neutron here. So I'm going to turn off neutron because neutron is acting upon the kick drum, and you're going to hear the difference of what I did to the kick drum that makes it stand out even more. So check this out. So in the next video, we're going to talk about achieving clarity in the kick by enhancing it. In this video, you could think of it as unmasking it, but I'm thinking in terms of actual like Neutron 3. If you use Track Assistant, it has unmask and it has enhance. So one way to make something stand out is to unmask it, and another way to make it stand out is to enhance it. So what we did in this video was to unmask the kick from the bass. And in the next video, I'm going to discuss achieving clarity in a kick drum by enhancing it. So if you stuck around to the end of this video, then I thank you for that. I hope that this is valuable to you and it helps you to mix. And as always, have an awesome day. Peace.